welcome. Can you guys hear me? Great. Hi. Still a little bit early. I guess it's exactly 7:30 here, so we can wait a little bit longer if other people want to show up. If you guys have questions that you want me to answer, feel free to jump in the chat. If you want to participate, if you want to share stories or something, I guess you can raise your hand somehow. One of these buttons you can push says raise your hand, and then I can give you permissions to speak. I'll probably wait a couple minutes, not too long. We can get going. Well, might as well start, I guess. People can always catch the recording. Okay, welcome everybody. I think we can jump into slides. These fireside chats are half formal and half informal, depending on how much time I have to prepare for it. Usually I have about an hour to put everything together. So sometimes the slides are a little bit more complicated than I would like. I try to make them as simple as I can. But that's what questions are for. So if something is complicated, or you have a different take, or you want a different take, just let me know. Okay. Start from slideshow. All right. Says screen sharing has failed to start. That's not a good sign. Try again. Share. We can see the screen. All right. Can everybody see that? I'll have to juggle back and forth just to see if you guys can see it, but I just want to make sure everything works. For starters. Okay. This is pretty low tech, I guess, but all right, we'll make do. You know what? Actually, I want to grab some notes I prepared. I'll be right back. All right, everything is the iPad. I'm showing the screen. I don't know if you can see this. I don't know if you'll be able to see me reading my notes, but hopefully that won't be a distraction. Okay. All right, back again. Share screen. Well, before I do that, maybe it's good to have an introduction for people who are less familiar with PTSD. to put this into context first, PTSD is a condition that's all too common, affecting a shocking number of people. In some overview studies that look at the epidemiology of PTSD, where is it coming from? There's a major portion of PTSD that comes from sexual relationship violence, interpersonal network traumatic experiences, to the tune of 33 and 30%. And that can be unexpected death of a loved one. It can be, life-threatening illnesses of a child, or it could be, interpersonal violence, where people are physically abused or witnessing abuse or something like that. Organized violence in some countries is a big source of PTSD. Participating in organized violence, so combat exposure, witnessing serious injuries and deaths, accidental or other sorts of serious injuries, and then obviously there's other stuff which doesn't fit into those categories. So toxic chemical exposure, like the oil or acid splashes we see in the news, or life-threatening motor vehicle accidents. The lifetime prevalence, so how much is this happening in general, is variable depending on where you look, but it's something between 6 and 10%. So almost 1 out of every 10 people in national samples in the United States and Canada. That's a staggering number. That's a major portion of people alive are experiencing this kind of trauma. It's really awful. I think it's kind of nice that we have a month where we can think about it, and I think people who are suffering, and it's not just veterans. It's women and men and people victims of all of these horrible things, deserve our compassion and understanding at the very least of what they're going through. And to some extent that means sympathy or empathy, understanding when someone's going through that, but also for those of us, who may not have immediate exposure to those people, I think just understanding, I think gives them a nod of respect and value, validity, give them some validity for their what they're going through. I think especially these days, we all have to be a little bit more understanding and compassionate with our neighbors. Or else we live in a world that is intolerant and ignorant. Okay, so why don't I start these slides? The slides are, PTSD is, and all these kinds of sort of subtopics are not very pretty. There aren't too many pretty pictures. You can see horrible traumas, and I don't want to show that stuff. I don't want this presentation to be more traumatic than it needs to be. But I tried to pick stuff that was at least interesting for people to pay attention to on a Zoom chat. So some of it is my data from my clinic. Some of it will be tables I pulled from studies, and then I'll talk through that and try to keep everybody's interest. If you have questions, I think I'll probably stop periodically between slides and come back if people have questions. For those of you that are here, and then largely we're also talking to a YouTube audience that'll be watching this later. Okay. I got rid of that slideshow. Okay, here we go. All right. Voila, the title. But this looks like the edit view. That's not useful. Slideshow. Start. Okay, welcome. Yeah, so I'll overview PTSD. We'll have some questions. So far, we have a couple questions from online that I'll try to answer through the talk, and then my plan is to talk about treating PTSD the usual way. What people are doing these days, standard of care treatment, and then cannabis, and where that fits in, how it fits in, why it fits in, and how people take it, what the clinical results that I see are in my clinic, how safe it is, what the sort of concerns are, and some examples from patients that I take care of. For those of you who are so inclined, I put all of the papers that I go through into a single folder, which is linked here at the bit.ly/seed PTSD. It's not the only PTSD folder I have on that drive, but for those of you who don't know, I have put together this huge library of cannabis literature that's free to read and search. It's a wealth of information. I encourage everybody to check it out. I earn nothing from it. It's just doing the right thing. Okay, so lots of studies about PTSD and cannabis. This probably surprises some people. The studies, though there are many, are not always great quality. We come from a culture that is demonized cannabis and studied it badly and studied it to prove that it was terrible for generations. Really, since cannabis has been around, there have been people who were either afraid of it or had bad experiences of it and were bad mouthing it. And if those people came to power, then we have the results that we saw through the world, which is people demonizing it and making stigma what we know today. So that has a meaningful impact in what we study. When the government right now gets when the government petitions a collection of studies, what does the literature tell us about cannabis? They're digging into a literature which is just soiled. It's just a cesspool of tainted studies from perspectives that were proving harm. It's not a fair sample. If you're picking among marbles that are all crushed, it's not a fair sample of how marbles function. And that's really the reality we have today. That a lot of the studies either have shown harm or have not been sort of well made. Like they're all people consuming, smoking cannabis instead of eating it or doing tinctures or all the other things that are available in modern times. So the pool that we have of cannabis studies is pretty lousy. Some of them are looking at self-reported cannabis use, and people always misremember or often misremember or are doing different things between different groups. So that's an important thing to think about. And also, what else are people doing? People are not just consuming cannabis; they're also potentially drinking alcohol or using cocaine or on opiates that are prescribed to them, ironically. So the study quality is not good, is the punchline. The studies in large part have looked at smoked cannabis, random variety, not necessarily the same cannabis between people. They've looked at strict CBD. That's more recently than in the past. They looked straight THC. They look at nabalone. These are some of the synthetic cannabinoids, and they see how they work, whether they work at all, how they're tolerated, and whether people are actually taking them. One of the things that's interesting through these studies that you'd find is one of the problems with regular medicine use to treat PTSD is that people don't take their medicines. They either have side effects, or they don't feel like they should take medicine, or they don't like how it makes them feel. One of the notable things about cannabis is that you don't see as much drop off when people are taking cannabis as part of a study. Certainly, they continue doing that, and that speaks a lot. I think one of the hallmarks of treatment is if people are actually doing it, and you have to have a treatment which is helpful and sustainable. Some of the struggles with studying cannabis, and I know this is pretty dry, so I'll move quickly. The struggles are determining how it works. How do you tell if something is working? Do they magically feel fine? Are they getting a little bit better? Are they able to do things a little bit better? That's a tough thing to actually measure, and especially in circumstances where it's illegal. These are in part veterans who are not allowed to discuss their cannabis use with their VA doctors. And they can't speak with a public around it because it's really sort of an uneducated public, and they're worried about feeling worse not only for dealing with their PTSD, but for consuming cannabis to try to help themselves. It's a horrible catch-22 that these folks are in. So it's definitely an uphill battle. And apart from the methodology sort of concerns I was alluding to before, this is built on bad research that it's terrible quality and mostly demonstrating harms. Another important thing that's an interesting problem is that cannabis requires guidance. Taking cannabis, or at least within these kinds of studies, and I think at least done well. If we send people into a field and tell them to take cannabis, the large majority of people are going to smoke it, and that's mostly destroying what they have paid for, and mutating the good stuff into things that they don't want. So there needs to be some guidance with cannabis use for it to be a medicine, or at least an effective medicine, and certainly one that we can study. So hopefully through all of this is clear that it's an uphill battle and it's complicated. And therefore, you can't really tell if cannabis, through looking at the existing literature, it's difficult to tell if this is causing problems, if it's not a good thing, or if it's actually a solution and is helping a lot. And that is partly because most of the studies out there are not determining causation. They're determining association. So many of the studies are observational. They're looking back at who's studying, who's consuming cannabis with PTSD, without PTSD. And of course, people who are suffering are going to be more likely to help themselves or try to help themselves. So they tend to be consuming a lot of cannabis. And one could say, oh, look, these 100 people who are consuming cannabis have PTSD, or they have worse PTSD. So it's tough to sort of flush out nuance if you can't see where the chicken is, and which is the chicken and which is the egg. The uses of cannabis basically boil down to a clear understanding of what PTSD is. So I'll pause from the slides here and just sort of talk about PTSD for a moment. Stop the share. Okay. I guess before I go into what PTSD is, are there any questions so far? And if there are, put them up there. And if there aren't, I'll just carry on. So PTSD is first of all stands for post-traumatic stress disorder. It's a unfortunately very common psychiatric disorder that results from a traumatic event, whether it's physical or psychological trauma, and it manifests through hyperarousal, anxiety, depressive symptoms, and sleep disturbances. It's in medicalese is described as sort of aberrant or unnatural or unhealthy adaptation to this traumatic event. There are a broad range of symptoms that people suffer with, including things related to cognition. So, repeated recall of the event that was traumatic, intrusive thoughts, flashbacks, nightmares, and in terms of mood, the depressive symptoms usually prevail, but also stressful anxiety sorts of symptoms, emotional things like psychological instability, just as it is, and being impulsive, being constantly on edge, having difficulty sleeping, or being irritable in normal sort of normal emotional states, and then impaired social activities also, social abilities. People have difficulty relating to other people or connecting with people who haven't experienced these terrible traumas. We all as social beings, we depend on sort of the understanding and compassion of fellow humans, and it's very difficult if you've experienced something which other people haven't. The conceptual model of PTSD as a disorder is really around fear conditioning and extinction. This is psychological language to help explain that there is a neurobiological dysfunction. So in our brains, which are made up of neural networks and chemistry, a fear event activates emotional centers in the brain. Actually, I have a picture of this. This is the trouble with doing ad hoc slideshows. That's not easy to prepare quickly. All right. Let me share this again. So brain stuff. Here we go. Brain stuff, you have lots of parts of the brain that are interacting and relevant to PTSD. And this becomes relevant not just to understand PTSD, but also to understand how cannabis functions. Because one of the things that's amazing and powerful about cannabis is that it impacts almost all of these, or literally all of these, and has different effects at different areas. So as we look to the future of what cannabis will do, once it is more well accepted and understood in the medical community and the general public, we're going to start seeing fine tuning of these different effects. You know, like what you can see, I'm pointing to the screen. What you can see here, some of these areas are about memory and sort of physical coordination. Some of them are about emotional control. Some of them are about understanding how your body is feeling and reacting in different ways in terms of consciousness. And you know, come 20 years, maybe we're going to start seeing cannabis used more precisely than it will be in the next 20 years till then. So to throw ideas out, I'll help translate the neurobiological explanations. We have an axis of stress in our bodies called the hypothalamic pituitary axis. It starts with hormones in our brains and it basically cascades down into a system of stress hormones, which fluctuate, obviously, depending on stressors, but also fluctuate depending on our natural endocannabinoid system. We have built-in stress-fighting molecules, and some of those are actually identical or bind to the same receptors as plant-based cannabis. So to some extent, we are hacking our system with cannabis, and it has effects that can be good and can be not so good. PTSD as the illness, just bumping back there, is, you know, as I'm just trying to highlight, a problem that affects many different aspects. You know, the hyperarousal stuff and the sleep stuff affects different parts of our brain. It involves different neurotransmitters. You know, the serotonin system, the noradrenaline system, our natural cannabinoid system, and even the opioid systems. So it's a full player traumatic sort of scenario. These people are not just anxious or just stressed or just sleeping badly. It's really an impact on their whole brain. And something like cannabis, which can impact the whole brain, you would think should play a pretty important role. Okay, so why cannabis? Okay, so why cannabis? Well, people with PTSD are twice as likely to report daily use of cannabis. So it's already being done. It's really the culture that has to catch up to what people are already doing. And actually, this is not correct. It's 2.5 times more likely to report lifetime at any point using cannabis. I've seen that statistic actually closer to 3. People on the other side, people who have PTSD are 2 to 4 times more likely to have substance use disorder. So these people who are suffering with PTSD are already doing something to try to help themselves. We I think in the cannabis community would rather them do something which is more helpful or potentially helpful and certainly less harmful than things like alcohol or cigarette smoking or other kinds of self-harm, like more illicit drugs. Another angle on this to think about it in terms of not just military PTSD or sexual PTSD, but even colleges. 3 out of 4 college students report experiencing at least one lifetime traumatic event, putting them at greater risk for substance use. And college students report using cannabis to cope pretty regularly. One study had the probability incredibly increased for males, and that brings up an interesting male-female difference, and how does this affect men and women differently? Um, and maybe we shouldn't dwell on that, but I'll move on to sort of why cannabis is helpful, because I think that's probably more interesting to the point of this fireside. So why cannabis? Cannabis is used for its calming, relaxing effects. It does distract, in certain combinations and doses. It helps people cope with some of the intrusion or the hyperarousal symptoms. So not just saying that it works, but this is a little bit getting into why it works. Um, um, a different version of why it works is the neurobiological reason. So to try to understand not just theoretically why it's working, but practically, I think is interesting. I'll try to translate this to common language. Basically, when someone is consuming cannabis, they have general inhibition. They're calming down neurotransmitter releases. We have a normal sort of busy traffic of neurotransmitter signaling in our brain, and cannabis tends to slow that down. Glutamate, serotonin, noradrenaline, dopamine are neurotransmitters that are constantly active in our brain, releasing signaling molecules from beginning to end. And cannabis, the presence of cannabinoids tends to hush that down. So people are going to be experiencing less hyperactivity, less, whatever the action of those particular neurotransmitters are doing. So we see biologically that it is working. It's not just people reporting. It's not just guesswork. It's not right now a very fine, not a very precise situation. It's more of a machine gun action than sniper rifle, but it is certainly working. And interestingly, when we look at animals, and they can do pretty horrible things to animals, such as eliminate their CB1 receptors. So these are the receptors that engage with cannabis. When they eliminate those, these animals tend to have, really heightened indices of anxiety and depression, and hyper sort of irritability. Things that you would see in someone who has PTSD, or an animal who has PTSD. Okay, so there's a lot more on this sort of path, which is very biological, very chemical, and pretty jargon heavy. So I think I'll skip that. If people have particular interest, I can expand there, but I don't want to put people to sleep. So why don't I take a pause with that and see if there are questions that people have, just to try to change up the mood. If you have questions, please list them in the chat. If you don't, I'll just move on. So one of the things to, I'll go back to this. I'll go back to the slides, but different slides, because I think some of what people might find interesting is data from my clinic. Okay, share. Okay. All right. So from my clinic, this is not so good. Shrink that. There we go. So I ask everybody who comes to my clinic sort of what they're coming with. And as you can see from this slide, out of one particular sample, we had 119, 12% who were acknowledging PTSD symptoms. So even in my clinic, it's about 10%, the usual population that I mentioned earlier. With respect to PTSD, the gender ratio tended to be male in my cohort, and I see a lot of military folks, so that makes sense. But there's still a portion of other that is not military. The vast majority of people, this is a really meaningful impact on their daily life. No surprise. Oops, I guess that's the same thing. And then with respect to how cannabis has helped them, this is something really I think should be highlighted, and I wish I could stand on a mountaintop and scream it, that people have really found cannabis to be remarkably helpful. I ask people how it's helped them with respect to physical symptoms, psychological symptoms, getting them off of opiates or other medicines, and the overwhelming majority of people report that it is meaningfully helpful, robustly so. As far as what people are doing, it's really all over the map. People do smoke a lot, unfortunately, but they also do other forms of cannabis that have varying effects. And I think this is more individual differences right now because the cannabis produced at stores is so general and so non-specific. Doses also all over the map. Everybody's a little bit different, and that's one of the nice things about cannabis and what we're learning from it is that medicine really should be individualized. That there is no one size fits all. There's no one pill that will cure everybody. This is just a slide actually to show that almost 40% of people who have PTSD are actually getting off of antidepressants or opiates or benzos. So in one sense, even if it wasn't working on its own, which it is, it's helping people avoid other medicines that could be potentially harmful. This is not necessarily actually just the PTSD stuff, but just want to make a point of sharing some of the nice news that I see around COVID, that people are feeling, 30% of people feel less lonely, less isolated when they're using their cannabis, or less depressed, or less pain, or they're sleeping better. Or actually, this 5% of people said that their parenting is getting better with their cannabis use. Just fun facts that I thought people might enjoy. In terms of cost savings, it's another angle that I think we should all consider, that people are spending a lot of money, especially in the pandemic, where money is tight, and cannabis can really help save costs from other therapies, other medicines, and certainly from other tools that people use to help themselves with PTSD. It says basically the same thing, that more than 50% of people think that their cannabis has saved them costs. 20% of people are not sure, but they give different answers and different questions, so who knows. This is a slide about stress hormones. I was alluding to this before. Our brains are producing these stress hormones, and our natural endocannabinoid system fluctuates accordingly. In adaptive ways for someone who adapts well to stressors, and in maladaptive ways to folks who don't adapt well. So when you see someone who's really stressed out, it might be the way their system is built. And the medical industry has really tried to approach this from a pharmaceutical perspective, but cannabis is a pharmaceutical, and we have a natural endocannabinoid system, and one would think that this would be part of the equation to at least consider. Shockingly, it is not. It's quite scandalous these days for ridiculous reasons. But this is also an illustration, just so you understand, that these hormones are naturally adjusting to the presence of cannabis or the absence of cannabis. So things fluctuate in our body naturally when we are stressed, whether it's PTSD or normal non-PTSD stress. And cannabis is a way of hacking that system. It's sort of, yeah. And the way it can hack is, either by addressing some of the enzymes which break down our natural neurotransmitters, or it can, sort of be hacking pleasure and just distraction, and sort of all the things I was mentioning before about how cannabis can work. But it can work on our natural system, or it can be, that's a hard concept to explain. Cannabis can work directly, so you feel pleasure, you feel sleepy, you feel distracted. It can also work indirectly, which is slowing down your cannabis chewing enzymes. So if your cannabis enzymes are hushed, then you have naturally boosted levels of, then you will have naturally boosted levels of these natural endocannabinoids. So it's a little bit subtly different, but I'm making this point just to illustrate that cannabis consumption to treat PTSD can have many different forms. There could be medicines which address those receptors, those enzymes. There can be straight cannabis, which is instituting pleasure or relieving stress. So really the field is quite large and wide open at this point. Okay. Want to talk about concerns and sort of the downside. I think this is a really important thing to mention, because nothing is free of side effects and concerns. There's always two sides of the coin. Impaired short memory is something that is common and potentially a reason why someone would want cannabis. If you're constantly being assaulted by memories, sometimes having impaired short-term memory is a blessing. But it does interfere with driving skills and motor coordination, and there's risk of injury there. And it's certainly impacting judgment, depending on sort of what someone's consuming. The risk of outbursts, whether they're violent or sexual or associated sort of evil that comes from that. In some people, cannabis actually induces anxiety. It can make things worse. And some of this has to do with their natural hormone levels, the natural enzyme levels, and what cannabis they took and what the environment is around them. And there's a lot of nuance and complexity about it. But that's an important thing to understand, that someone could be cannabis naive, have PTSD, and take cannabis, and it can actually get worse. Why that's happening is sort of very different on an individual basis, but it's important to realize and recognize. Especially for someone who's already suffering with PTSD, increasing that anxiety would be pretty horrible. And actually, one thing that happens, even if someone does not have a bad reaction, over time, if they build up a tolerance, they can have a worsening reaction. Different strains of cannabis might affect them differently that way. Different down regulations of their natural endocannabinoid hormone systems, as I was mentioning. Separate from that, there are some toxic effects, if we call it that, including making people hyperthermic, so not cold but too hot. For some people, cannabis can irritate the lining of their throat or lungs, albeit temporarily. And then when people are taking cannabis regularly, say to treat PTSD, as soon as they stop, there's a withdrawal effect. It can be quite unpleasant in the short run. It's generally not terribly harmful in the long run, but it is there. Okay, hopefully that's pretty clear. And just to sort of, I guess, put a close to this section of the slideshow, I want to dip down into something that's a little bit more somber, which is to recognize that the rate of suicide around PTSD is alarmingly high. And with respect to cannabis, there is a association with cannabis use and suicide. If you think about it, if you're against cannabis, you could interpret this association, which, as I alluded to before, is not causation. You could interpret that as, well, people who consume cannabis are more likely to kill themselves. Or you could interpret it differently, which is people who are suffering terribly try to help themselves meaningfully. And unfortunately, some of those people succumb to their illnesses. We don't have any reason to think cannabis causes people to harm themselves. Quite the opposite. But unfortunately, this is a reality of literature these days, of medical research, and people who are not so carefully thinking about it, or who want to prove a point and deceive their audiences, can certainly twist data like this. This is a similar kind of image, which you can see the dotted line is people that have high PTSD, and the blue line is people that have low PTSD. And over time, as they use more and more cannabis, the likelihood of suicidal behavior increases. And same thing applies here. This is not necessarily suggesting that cannabis is causing that, but people who are trying to help themselves over a long period of time, or as disease progresses, they're more likely to have suicidal thoughts or behaviors. This is also true, actually, without cannabis. I have another slide that I skipped over that talks about that. Nope. Um, hmm, ah, and this is, this is PTSD levels. Basically, the severity of PTSD over time, whether they're using high or low or average cannabis, it's all kind of the same. And this is people who use no cannabis, and pink is people who use cannabis, and over time the PTSD severity gets worse no matter what. Um, all right, I'm gonna leave it there. Um, okay, questions. Dosing guidelines and best methods for PTSD. This is sort of the more tangible stuff. Guidelines really depend on the specific PTSD at hand. Someone who is a young woman who's experienced sexual trauma will need different dosages and different cannabinoids from someone who has sleep disorder or persistent irritating thoughts or intrusive thoughts from military exposure. So it's very personalized. Is the punchline. I'd actually generally recommend not focusing too much on the cannabis itself at the beginning when deciding what to do with someone who has PTSD. I think it's better to sort of set the stage and make sure that the environment is ideal. One of the more powerful effects of cannabis, even than the cannabis itself, in terms of its effect, is how it interacts with someone's environment. If the stage is not set, if the folks around you are annoying, if you are stressed about work and the politics and your health, those anxieties are going to be present in your body while you're taking cannabis. And what we see is that cannabis amplifies those effects, the bad ones. So flip that on its head. Part of cannabis consumption really should be managing the environment and sort of creating an ambiance which is supportive and calming and helpful, and sort of um, an easy transition for cannabis to amplify that. And that's very tricky thing for someone, especially with PTSD, who's dealing with this on all sides, more or less at all times. So the challenge is not to think about cannabis as the sledgehammer, which is creating ideal scenario. It doesn't work that way. Cannabis is far more complex. It's interacting with so many more systems than our Western pharmaceuticals are. That cannabis action today, treatment today, needs to incorporate all of what we understand from a high level, which is not just that it works on neurotransmitters and has function, but also it works within an environment and has different effects for different people. Most people are familiar with the adage, go low and slow. That's not always useful. I think it depends on the symptoms. If someone is severely suffering, sometimes starting with higher doses makes sense. If someone is totally adverse to feeling euphoric effects, them picking products which are avoiding THC is reasonable. But I tend to encourage people to think about their health holistically. Are they exercising? Are they treating themselves well? Are they doing the other things in their life which support success? And then the cannabis can help facilitate that, can help amplify those effects. Is that helpful? I'll assume it is, or I put you to sleep. Um, all right. Other questions? Hopefully this was somewhat helpful. It's a little bit all over the map, but these fireside chats are still evolving. Any other questions? one of the things I didn't talk about is sort of the conditioning associated with PTSD and what's happening in our brains, and the current solutions. There are some which are pharmaceutical. So SSRIs and SNRIs, medicines that calm the activation in our body, the adrenaline, sort of. And some of them are therapies, talk therapies, that try to disentangle the trauma with the feeling of anxiety and stress and sort of the body symptoms. One of the things that is interesting to know about cannabis is that cannabis users, chronic cannabis users, people who are using it over a long period of time, actually have more difficulty with extinction learning. So learning to separate the fear or the trauma with their body sensations. That's more difficult for cannabis consumers, and part of that might be what I was alluding to about the sort of overall hushing of neurotransmitter effects. That sort of while someone is actively intoxicated, if we call it that, or has cannabis flowing through their veins, that they are sort of less receptive to change. And part of that might be memory. That the short-term memory stuff is kicking in, and they're just not absorbing lessons as readily as people who are not with cannabis. But it's an important thing to know that cannabis might have positive effects, but it also has, it provides limitations for the current therapies to be working. So it's a little bit of not a catch-22, but it's some up, some down. And half humorous, but half unfortunate. In cannabis studies that look at presence of cannabis in PTSD treatment and the absence of cannabis in PTSD treatment, so meaning the people that consume and don't consume, the folks who consume cannabis tend to drop out, more at least than the people who don't. And part of that might be that they're doing well and they don't want to deal with this research baloney. Some of it might be that the cannabis is affecting their motivation. TBD, as they say. Another interesting point to just highlight a little bit is that the presence of cannabis is not coming in a vacuum. That between 5 and 20% of at least veterans with PTSD are consuming cocaine and opiates and amphetamines. That this is a state of body and mind that they are suffering with, and they're not sitting around twiddling their thumbs waiting for doctors to give them the right pills. They move to things which help them, and the proof is really in the pudding that an overwhelming number of veterans consume cannabis, and the real damage that the culture does is demonize it and make them feel bad for using cannabis, and make the sort of hospital systems for them, the VAs, unable to recommend it or even talk about it. And it puts these suffering veterans in a really horrible place, a really unfair situation. That's just a shameful reality. Okay, so we're approaching 8:20. It's almost an hour. I'm happy to take questions if I can make it this more personalized. I certainly have plenty more stuff I could cover, but the idea is hopefully to get questions addressed. I guess for the last couple minutes, I can talk a little bit about unofficial PTSD. One of the interesting things I've learned when I ask people about what they're suffering with and what they bring to the table, many people highlight PTSD. And it's interesting because they don't always carry that diagnosis from Western medicine. In other words, some people feel like they have what they call PTSD, But the doctors they've seen, at least those from whom I have medical records, don't share that diagnosis that their patients have. And that's an interesting pool of patients. It's an interesting thing for me to think about, because on the one hand, people feel maybe like anxiety isn't a legitimate enough illness, or depression, or sleep issues, or irritating thoughts, or nightmares. That's not enough validation of their concerns, that they want to embrace PTSD as a sort of badge of suffering. And it might be that. It might be as simple as that, that our culture sort of gets bored of sympathy, or bored of compassion, when someone says they have anxiety or depression, or nightmares, and that somehow PTSD is more dramatic and is more likely to elicit a sympathetic response. I don't know, but I have noticed that a lot of people feel traumatized by things in their life, and to some extent, that is the 10% I mentioned before. That depends how you categorize PTSD. It's not only veterans in war, or men and women being subject to sexual violence. It can be someone who felt unwanted, or felt abused at school, or teased at school, and they took that to a really meaningful place in their life, and are traumatized by it for a long period of time. To some extent, part of the cannabis world is engaging with people like that, who don't fit the usual model, who may not satisfy the check marks on a Western medical philosophy, but who still want care and still find it helpful. I think that's an interesting reality about cannabis, is that it at this point doesn't belong in the box of Western medicine, or isn't currently there. Let's put it that way. And that means it's subject to a lot more interpretation. That people can use cannabis how they see fit, and they get to have this pharmacy, this medicine, and tailor it to what works for them. And I think that's the essence of what medicine should be. That doctors shouldn't be throwing pills at people because a book tells them to do that. They should be listening to the person in front of them, and adjusting based on what the person thinks is their reality. And that's actually a new, unfamiliar concept to medical practitioners these days. That people who come in thinking they have PTSD, I think should be addressed as having PTSD, and to uncover what was traumatic for them, and sort of help them understand the environment around which they can, help themselves with cannabis, and for us to take their experience and learn from it. Part of this whole process is learning what the literature says, and how good or bad it is, what the patients are telling us, what the sort of culture is telling us, and then also to deal with individuals that fit their own bill, and don't average out. I think that's one of the sorry things about medicine, is that everybody gets the details get lost, and individuality is pretty important. All right, so it seems like maybe everybody's asleep, or I'm boring people, so I should call it a night. If there are questions, I'm always happy to field them, either through social media or here. I do open office hours without plans, or talks every Monday. And we have some of these talks periodically on topics. All of these recordings end up on YouTube. And if you have interest, you're welcome to that. The bit.ly link I'll put here, which is just bit.ly/CED and then lowercase YouTube. But you can also, reach out to me through cedclinic.com. And hopefully this was helpful. It's a complex subject, and horribly tragic. And there are 1,000 ways to go. But I think the future is undoubtedly involving cannabis, and it's just a matter of when. And I'm doing my best to make sure that it gets there as soon as possible. All right, thanks everybody for joining. Have a good night.